Here's the thing about King Kong. He's not just an ape, he's a giant ape. It's his defining feature in the 1933 movie that birthed him and the ultimate cause of his tragic demise. Picking up people, climbing skyscrapers, fighting dinosaurs, being huge is Kong's whole deal. Skull Island: Rise of Kong is bad for a lot of reasons, but the main one is it's a game that lets you play as an iconically large gorilla and somehow manages to make him feel exceedingly average. Rise of Kong portrays him in the most bland way possible, and then it matches that mediocrity for everything else around him. Rise of Kong lets you experience how Kong became King Kong, which was apparently by beating a lot of creatures to death and getting really angry while doing it. After swearing revenge on the giant raptor that killed Kong's parents, like some sort of gorilla Batman, you'll punch your way through each of Skull Island's 5 levels, all of which are as massive as they are boring. There's absolutely nothing here you haven't seen before in 100 melee-focused action games. Combat gives Kong a light attack and a heavy attack, a dodge roll, and a block. While you'll earn some special moves along the way, there's never any reason to really use them. Killing the boss at the end of each level unlocks new, but not particularly interesting, abilities, like a ground pound punch that hurts enemies and can break through certain rocks, or a heavy attack that can stun enemies and break through certain other rocks. Each new move also has skill trees with attributes you can buy that provide some nominal upgrades. But no matter what you upgrade or unlock, every fight is pretty much the same. First, hammer the light attack button to perform a 3-hit combo. Then, use Kong's only cool ability, a shoulder charge that shoots him forward a short distance and can temporarily stun enemies, to interrupt the attack of whatever you're fighting. When the enemy takes enough damage, hit another button to perform a finishing move. Repeat, repeat, repeat. There are other little elements, such as an overly familiar rage ability that powers up all your attacks, but they're only good for breaking up your combo or finishing a fight slightly faster. You're never required to think about how an enemy attacks and use a special move to deal with it, or to change up tactics based on how many or which kinds of enemies are on the field. You play a giant ape who routinely kills literal dinosaurs, and Rise of Kong manages to make that prospect dull and lifeless. Thankfully, it's easy to just run past most enemies, and you'll probably want to once you realize that there are hundreds of them, and they mostly just waste your time. Skill points to make Kong stronger are only dished out at special Ascension events, which are fights in specific arenas that are closed off until you finish them. They come in 2 flavors: kill all the enemies in the area, or climb around and destroy the nests of flying dinosaurs. Once you're done with the objective, you get a few points to invest into one of your meager upgrades. That means only boss fights and Ascension events actually help make Kong stronger, and the many, many other enemies are just pointless filler. The Ascension events at least try to change things up by throwing different combinations of enemies at you, but the repetitive combat means they all shake out exactly the same way, requiring you to spend about a second to identify the 2 or 3 combat animations the enemies have, and then avoid the ones that can actually hurt you. There are 5 total Ascension events in each level, and they're mostly pretty hard to miss, but like the rest of combat, they never feel satisfying or even particularly necessary to complete. Blow past one, and you'll miss out on a few points to unlock skills you don't really need, so who cares? The boss fights stand out at least a little from standard battles, with each including its own signature mechanic to shake things up. For instance, the big sandworm boss throws rocks out of the earth when it emerges to attack you, and you can then bait it into smacking its head into those rocks, stunning it. You don't need to do that. You can just stand there and wail on the thing, stepping back before it does one of its 3 attacks. But at least these fights attempt to engage your brain more than Rise of Kong's bog standard battles. They are still derivative, simplistic, and unimaginative, but they're definitely better than the low bar set by everything else. Kong is a gorilla, so of course, climbing and jumping make up the other half of Skull Island. Like combat, the platforming here is the most pedestrian version of ideas you've seen before. You'll jump over a few gaps and climb some vines. Exciting, I know. Movement is more inoffensive than annoying, but it's worsened by level design that is absolutely unhinged. Each level is huge, a meandering and winding series of pathways that branch, loop, and cut back on one another. Your only goal is to get from one side of the biome to the other, but Skull Island is constantly trying to confuse you along the way, with an in-game map that only serves to preview how lost you're about to get. My assumption is that there may have been a version of Rise of Kong where tracking down Ascension events, collectibles, and smart paths through levels was part of a bigger focus on exploration than there is in the final game. As usual though, that idea is executed only in its thinnest and most simplistic form. Instead, you just get a confusing tangle of a level, and your main challenge is to avoid accidentally wasting time by making big circles back to earlier areas on the map. All of these elements, from platforming to combat, boss fights to skill allocation, are marred by Rise of Kong's many technical issues. Bugs abound, and despite the mercifully short campaign taking me only about 5 hours altogether, there were points when it appeared to softlock and become impossible to finish at all. Kong got stuck in platforms, fell through waterfalls, and disappeared behind objects. One boss froze up after 30 seconds of fighting and never moved again, standing perfectly still while I 3-hit comboed him into the ground. Enemies sometimes wouldn't spawn correctly during Ascension events, a problem that could only be solved by loading an earlier save and hoping it worked correctly on another go. And midway through, all the skill upgrades I had unlocked spontaneously relocked themselves, and the points I'd spent on them just disappeared. Luckily, none of those upgrades actually mattered. And as it's probably clear by now, Rise of Kong is an ugly game, with dated graphics and a mostly flat art style of gray rock walls and repetitive jungle trees. Its almost cartoonish vibe feels more like an attempt to mask its blocky low-res character designs rather than an artistic choice. Cutscenes frequently include animations of creatures moving around like they've been picked up and dropped somewhere else. And there's this ridiculous flashback moment that just pastes a square of a still image over the screen. There are also numerous points where you'll see trees not quite attached to the ground, or rocks just haphazardly duplicated on top of each other. It all just looks sloppy and rushed, providing more evidence of a game that was created without a lot of care. Skull Island is ugly and full of bugs, but the real trouble is that at its core, it's just boring. It makes no meaningful attempts to do anything new or clever, with mindless combat and pointless platforming that make it feel like a worse version of every action game from the last 20 years. This isn't the kind of bad game you can play to laugh at, or that took some cool swings but missed, or that creates weird combinations of technical snafus that lead to unexpected but entertaining results. It doesn't even rate enough to be called frustrating. Rise of Kong is fundamentally disinterested in itself. A giant ape game that doesn't even care enough about what it's doing to make the ape feel giant. For more of 2023's worst games, check out our reviews of The Lord of the Rings Gollum or Testament, The Order of High Human, which actually scored lower than Kong. And for everything else, including a few good games, stick with IGN.